I remember the first time I tried to speak English with someone. My heart was beating fast and my hands were sweating. I wanted to say something, but I was afraid of making mistakes. The person in front of me was waiting for my response, but my mind went blank. I felt nervous and embarrassed. Speaking English was not easy for me at that moment. I had studied English for many months. I knew grammar rules and vocabulary, but speaking was different. When I tried to speak, my words didn't come out naturally. I always translated from my native language in my head. This made my sentences slow and unnatural. I needed a way to speak more fluently. One day, I decided to practice more. I looked for ways to improve my speaking skills. I started listening to English conversations and repeating them. I also talked to myself in English when I was alone. At first, it felt strange, but it helped me get used to forming sentences quickly. Then, I found an online language exchange partner. We talked every day for 15 minutes. At first, I made many mistakes, but my partner was patient. He corrected me and encouraged me to keep going. With time, I started feeling more confident. I realized that the fear of speaking was in my mind. I needed to practice and make mistakes to learn. Speaking was like riding a bike. At first, you fall many times, but if you keep practicing, you improve. I was ready to continue my journey to fluency. Chapter 2: Practicing with Real Conversations. After realizing that fear was my biggest obstacle, I decided to take action. I needed to practice real conversations with people who spoke English fluently. I started by going to public places where I knew I could find English speakers, such as coffee shops, libraries, and tourist spots. At first, I only listened to their conversations, trying to understand their words and expressions. I paid attention to how they greeted each other, how they started a conversation, and how they responded. The more I listened, the more familiar I became with natural English conversations. One day, I finally gathered the courage to speak. I was in a coffee shop and I heard a tourist asking for directions. I knew the answer, but I hesitated. My heart was pounding and I felt nervous, but I reminded myself that I had to try. I took a deep breath and said, "Excuse me, I can help you. The place you are looking for is 2 blocks away." The tourist smiled and thanked me. It was a short conversation, but it gave me confidence. I realized that I didn't need perfect grammar to communicate. I just needed to be clear and simple. After that day, I made it a habit to start small conversations with people. I asked shopkeepers how their day was going. I greeted strangers on the street, and I even asked questions at the supermarket. Sometimes people responded with long sentences that I didn't fully understand, but I didn't panic. I focused on keywords and context. If I didn't understand something, I simply said, "Could you repeat that, please?" Or could you say it in a simpler way? I learned that people were kind and willing to help. Another thing that helped me was recording myself speaking in English. I would choose a topic such as my daily routine or my favorite hobby and talk for a few minutes. Then I listened to my recordings and tried to improve my pronunciation and fluency. It was difficult at first because I felt awkward hearing my own voice, but over time, I noticed my progress. I sounded more natural and confident with each recording. Speaking English in real-life situations became easier for me. I learned that mistakes were part of the process, and the more I practiced, the more comfortable I felt. My goal was no longer to speak perfectly, but to communicate effectively. The fear I once had started to disappear, and I felt excited to continue improving. Chapter 3: Learning to Think in English. One of the biggest problems I faced was translating everything from my native language before speaking. This made my sentences slow and unnatural. I knew I had to train my brain to think in English directly, but I didn't know how. I started researching and found several techniques to help me. The first one was simple: describing everything around me in English. When I walked down the street, I looked at objects and said their names in my mind. There's a red car. The sky is blue. That person is wearing a black jacket. At first, I only used single words, but later I started forming sentences. That car is moving fast. The sky is clear today. That person looks happy. This simple practice helped me connect words and ideas faster. Another technique I used was having silent conversations with myself. For example, if I was making coffee in the morning, I would think, I need to boil water. Now I add coffee to the cup. It smells good. Instead of thinking in my native language and translating, I force myself to think directly in English. At first, it was difficult, but with practice, it became easier. Reading and listening to English every day also helped. I watched movies, listened to podcasts, and read books in English. Instead of translating everything, I try to understand the meaning from context. When I encountered new words, I didn't always look them up in a dictionary. Instead, I guessed their meaning based on the sentence. This helped my brain get used to English without depending on my native language. With time, I noticed a huge improvement. I could form sentences faster, and my conversations felt more natural. I still made mistakes, but I didn't stop to correct every little error. I learned to keep talking and focus on the message instead of perfection. Thinking in English changed everything for me. Chapter 4: Expanding my vocabulary naturally. At this point, I was more confident speaking, but I realized that my vocabulary was limited. Sometimes I wanted to express an idea, but didn't know the right words. This made me feel frustrated. I knew I had to expand my vocabulary, but I didn't want to memorize long lists of words. Instead, I decided to learn new words naturally through context. One of the best ways I found was reading stories and articles in English. Whenever I saw a new word, I didn't stop immediately to look it up. Instead, I try to guess its meaning based on the sentence. If I saw the word multiple times, I wrote it down and searched for its definition later. This method helped me remember words better because I learned them in real situations. Another technique that helped me was using new words in my daily conversations. Whenever I learn a new word, I challenge myself to use it at least 3 times that day. If I learn the word improve, I would say I want to improve my English, or this book helped me improve my vocabulary. Using words in context made them stick in my memory. I also started watching TV shows with subtitles. At first, I used subtitles in my native language, but later I switched to English subtitles. This helped me connect spoken words with written text. I noticed that native speakers often used informal phrases and slang that I hadn't learned in school. Watching real conversations improved my understanding and helped me speak more naturally. Learning new words became fun instead of stressful. I no longer forced myself to memorize long lists. Instead, I focused on exposure and usage. The more I listened, read, and spoke, the more words I learned naturally. Chapter 5: Becoming a Confident English Speaker. After months of practice, I started noticing a big change. Speaking English no longer felt like a challenge. It felt natural. I still made mistakes, but I didn't let them stop me. I learned that confidence was more important than perfection. The more I believed in myself, the better I communicated. One thing that helped me build confidence was speaking in front of a mirror. I looked at myself and practiced different conversations. I imagined situations like introducing myself or ordering food at a restaurant. This exercise helped me improve my pronunciation and body language. When I spoke with real people, I felt more prepared. I also learned to embrace mistakes. Before, I was afraid of saying something wrong, but now I saw mistakes as opportunities to learn. If I used the wrong verb tense, I simply corrected myself and moved on. The important thing was to keep the conversation going. Native speakers don't expect perfection. They appreciate the effort. Finally, I realized that speaking English was not just about words. It was about connection. The purpose of language is to communicate, to share ideas, and to connect with people. When I focused on communication instead of grammar, my conversations became more natural and enjoyable. Speaking English changed my life. I made new friends, learned about different cultures, and open new opportunities for myself. I still have a lot to learn, but I am no longer afraid. Now, I see English as an adventure, and I am excited to keep improving every day. Chapter 6: The Power of Daily Practice. I realized that speaking English fluently required consistent practice. If I only practiced once in a while, my progress was slow. I needed to make English a daily habit. I decided to dedicate at least 30 minutes each day to speaking, listening, and thinking in English. Even if I was busy, I found a way to include English in my routine. The more I practiced, the more natural it became. One of my favorite methods was shadowing. I listened to native speakers and repeated what they said immediately. This helped me improve my pronunciation, rhythm, and fluency. At first, it was difficult to keep up, but after a few weeks, I noticed a big improvement. My speech became smoother, and I started imitating natural intonation. To make learning more fun, I also used tongue twisters. These help me train my mouth and tongue to pronounce difficult sounds. At first, I struggled, but with practice, I got better. Simple phrases like, "She sells seashells by the seashore," improved my articulation. This small exercise helped me gain more control over my pronunciation. Another important change I made was surrounding myself with English. I changed my phone settings to English, started thinking in English throughout the day, and even dreamed in English sometimes. The more I immersed myself, the more comfortable I felt with the language. It was no longer something I studied. It became part of my life. I learned that improvement doesn't happen overnight. It takes patience and dedication. Some days were frustrating, but I reminded myself why I started. My goal was to communicate clearly, and every small effort brought me closer to fluency. The key was consistency, and I was determined to keep going. Chapter 7: Speaking with Confidence in Public. After months of practice, I felt comfortable speaking in casual conversations, but I still hesitated in public situations. I wanted to be able to express myself in front of a group without feeling nervous. I knew I needed to overcome this fear, so I started practicing in small ways. I spoke louder when ordering food, asked questions in English at stores, and gave short explanations when people asked me something. To challenge myself, I joined an online speaking group. Every week, we had a topic to discuss. At first, I was shy, and I only spoke a little, but over time, I gained confidence. The group was supportive, and I realized that everyone made mistakes. The important thing was to communicate, not to be perfect. This helped me relax and speak more freely. One of the best experiences I had was giving a short speech in English. I prepared a simple presentation about my culture and shared it with a small group. I was nervous, but I practiced many times before the event. When I finally spoke, I made some mistakes, but no one cared. They listened to my ideas, and that was what really mattered. Speaking in public also taught me how to stay calm. I learned to take deep breaths, slow down my speech, and focus on my message instead of my mistakes. These techniques helped me speak clearly and confidently. The more I practiced, the easier it became. Now, I no longer feel afraid to speak English in public. I still get nervous sometimes, but I know how to manage my fear. Every conversation is an opportunity to learn and improve. I am no longer the person who is too afraid to speak. I have grown and I feel proud of my progress. Chapter 8: Understanding Fast English Speakers. One of the biggest challenges I faced was understanding native speakers. When they spoke slowly, I had no problem, but in real conversations, they spoke fast, used slang, and sometimes connected words in ways I didn't recognize. I felt lost and frustrated. I knew I needed to improve my listening skills to keep up with natural conversations. I started by listening to podcasts and audiobooks at normal speed. At first, I didn't understand everything, but I focused on getting the general idea. I resisted the urge to translate every word. Instead, I tried to guess meanings from context. Over time, I started recognizing common phrases and expressions more easily. Watching TV shows and movies also helped me. I started with subtitles in English, then gradually removed them. At first, it was difficult, but my brain started adapting. I realized that native speakers often reduced words. For example, going to became gonna and want to became wanna. Recognizing these patterns made conversations easier to understand. Another technique that helped me was listening to the same audio multiple times. The first time, I try to understand the general meaning. The second time, I focused on details. The third time, I repeated key phrases out loud. This method trained my ears to catch words more easily. Now, I feel much more comfortable when listening to fast English. I still don't understand everything, but I have developed strategies to keep up. Instead of feeling frustrated, I stay patient and focus on understanding the main idea. My listening skills have improved, and conversations are much easier. Chapter 9: Overcoming the Fear of Making Mistakes. At the beginning of my journey, I was terrified of making mistakes. I didn't want to sound silly, and I was afraid that people would judge me. Because of this fear, I sometimes avoided speaking, even when I had the chance. I realized that this was holding me back, and I needed to change my mindset. I started observing how native speakers spoke. I noticed that even they made mistakes sometimes. They corrected themselves and kept going. This made me realize that making mistakes was a normal part of communication. No one expected me to be perfect. The important thing was to keep talking, to become more comfortable with mistakes. I set a goal to make at least 5 mistakes every day. Instead of being embarrassed, I saw mistakes as a sign of progress. When someone corrected me, I didn't feel bad. I felt grateful. Every correction helped me improve. I also changed my attitude toward learning. Instead of focusing on perfection, I focused on improvement. I reminded myself that fluency comes from practice, not for being perfect. The more I spoke, the better I became. Little by little, my confidence grew. Now, I speak without fear. I still make mistakes, but they don't stop me. I see every conversation as a learning opportunity. I have realized that confidence is more important than perfect grammar. What truly matters is the ability to communicate and connect with others. Chapter 10: Becoming Fluent and Enjoying the Journey. After months of dedication, I reached a point where speaking English felt natural. I no longer needed to translate in my head. I could have conversations without hesitation. I wasn't perfect, but I was fluent, and that was what mattered most. I finally felt comfortable expressing myself. One of the biggest lessons I learned was that fluency is not just about words, it's about attitude. When I stopped worrying about mistakes and focused on communication, my confidence grew. I learned to enjoy the process instead of stressing about perfection. English became part of my daily life, and I no longer saw it as something difficult. I also realized that learning never stops. Even native speakers continue expanding their vocabulary and improving their skills. Instead of feeling frustrated about what I didn't know, I became excited about what I could still learn. This mindset made my learning journey more enjoyable. Now, I help others who are in the same situation I was in. I encourage them to practice, to be patient, and to believe in themselves. I remind them that fluency is possible for anyone who is willing to put in the effort. My experience has taught me that persistence and confidence are the keys to success. Speaking English has changed my life. It has opened new opportunities, helped me make new friends, and allowed me to connect with people from different cultures. I no longer see English as just a language. I see it as a bridge to the world. And I know that my journey is just beginning. Chapter 11: Developing a Natural Accent. When I first started speaking English, my accent was very strong. It was difficult for native speakers to understand me sometimes, and I felt embarrassed. I wanted to improve my pronunciation, but I didn't know how. I used to think that having an accent was a bad thing, but then I realized that accents are natural. My goal was not to sound exactly like a native speaker, but to be clear and understandable. I started practicing pronunciation daily. I used an app that helped me compare my pronunciation with native speakers. I also watched videos where teachers explained how to position the tongue and lips for different sounds. I realized that some English sounds didn't exist in my native language, so I had to train my mouth to pronounce them correctly. It was challenging, but with practice I improved. One of the best exercises I found was reading aloud. I chose books and articles in English and read them out loud every day. At first, I focused on pronouncing each word correctly. Later, I worked on improving my intonation and rhythm. I noticed that English speakers often connected words, and I practiced doing the same. For example, instead of saying, "What are you doing?" slowly, I learned to say it naturally, like, "What ya doing?" Listening to music and singing along also helped me a lot. I chose songs with clear lyrics and repeated them until I could sing along without hesitation. This made my pronunciation more fluid and natural. I didn't realize it at first, but this fun activity was actually helping me sound more like a native speaker. Now, I feel much more confident in my pronunciation. My accent is still there, but I speak clearly and people understand me easily. I have learned that having an accent is not a problem. What matters most is being able to communicate effectively. The key is to practice, listen carefully, and never be afraid to try. Chapter 12. Expanding my vocabulary naturally. In the beginning, I struggled with vocabulary. I often found myself using the same words repeatedly, and I couldn't express myself the way I wanted to. I memorized word lists, but I forgot them quickly. I realized that I needed a new approach to learning vocabulary. Instead of just memorizing words, I had to learn how to use them in real conversations. I started reading books, articles, and blogs in English. Whenever I found a new word, I didn't just look up its meaning. I also paid attention to how it was used in a sentence. I wrote down example sentences and tried to use the new words in my own sentences. This method helped me remember words better because I was using them actively instead of just memorizing them. Watching movies and TV shows also helped me learn new vocabulary naturally. I listened to how native speakers used different words in different situations. I paid attention to slang, idioms, and casual expressions that weren't in textbooks. When I heard a new phrase, I tried to repeat it and use it in my own conversations. Another technique that helped me was learning words in groups. Instead of learning words randomly, I focused on related words. For example, if I learned the word travel, I also learned words like ticket, airport, luggage, and passport. This made it easier to remember new vocabulary because the words were connected in my mind. Now, I don't worry about memorizing words. I focus on learning vocabulary naturally through reading, listening, and speaking. My vocabulary has improved a lot, and I can express myself more clearly. I have learned that the best way to remember words is to use them in real situations. Chapter 13. Thinking in English instead of translating. One of the biggest obstacles I faced was that I always translated from my native language before speaking in English. This made my conversations slow and unnatural. I wanted to be able to think directly in English, but I didn't know how to do it. I realized that I needed to train my brain to process English without relying on translation. I started with simple exercises. Every day, I described things around me in English. When I saw a car, I didn't think of the word in my language first. I tried to say car immediately. When I looked at the sky, I thought the sky is blue. At first, it felt strange, but with practice, it became easier. I also changed the way I practiced writing. Instead of writing in my native language and translating, I forced myself to write directly in English. I wrote journal entries, short stories, and even text messages in English. This helped me organize my thoughts in English without depending on my native language. Speaking to myself in English was another great technique. Whenever I was alone, I spoke about what I was doing, what I was thinking, or what I planned to do. For example, while cooking, I would say, "Now I'm cutting the vegetables. Next, I will boil the water." This exercise helped me think faster in English. Over time, I noticed a big difference. I no longer needed to translate every word in my head. My brain started recognizing English patterns automatically. Now, when I speak, words come naturally. Thinking in English has made my conversations smoother and faster. Chapter 14. Understanding different English accents. At first, I only practiced with American English because that was what I was most familiar with. However, when I listened to British or Australian English, I had trouble understanding. I realized that English had many different accents and I needed to be able to understand them all. I started by listening to different accents online. I found YouTube videos where people from different countries spoke English. I listened carefully to how they pronounced words differently. For example, in British English, water sounds like wada, while in American English, it sounds like water. Recognizing these small differences helped me understand accents better. I also watched movies and TV shows from different countries. Instead of avoiding accents I didn't understand, I exposed myself to them. At first, it was difficult, but my ears gradually adjusted. I learned to focus on the context instead of every single word. This helped me understand meaning even if I missed a few words. Practicing with different speakers also helped. I joined online conversation groups where people had various accents. At first, I asked them to repeat things, but over time, I got used to their pronunciation. I realized that understanding different accents is just a matter of practice. Now, I feel comfortable listening to different varieties of English. I don't panic when I hear an unfamiliar accent. I know that with enough exposure and practice, I can understand anyone. This skill has made my communication much easier and more enjoyable. Chapter 15. Never stopping the learning process. After months of practice, I had reached a level where I could speak English confidently. But I knew that learning never really ends. There's always more to learn, more words to discover, and more skills to improve. I decided that I would continue learning English for the rest of my life. I set new challenges for myself. I started reading more advanced books and articles. I watched documentaries and listened to academic podcasts to expand my vocabulary. I also practiced writing longer texts to improve my grammar. Learning new things in English became an exciting challenge rather than a difficult task. I also stayed connected with the language by talking to native speakers regularly. I made friends who spoke English, and we had conversations about different topics. This kept me engaged and motivated. Speaking English was no longer just about learning. It was about connecting with people. Now, English is a natural part of my life. I no longer see it as something I have to study. I see it as a tool that allows me to communicate and explore the world. I know that as long as I keep practicing, I will continue to improve. My journey with English has taught me one important lesson. Learning a language is not about being perfect. It's about making progress every day. And I am excited to keep learning, growing, and becoming even more fluent.